مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. كان عام 2021 عاما كبيرا بالنسبة إلى الحزب الديمقراطي. فاز مرشحه جو بايدن بالرئاسة، مما جعل دونالد ترامب أول رئيس يخسر انتخابات الولاية الثانية خلال توليه منصبه منذ ما يقرب من 30 عاما. وسيطر الحزب على مجلسي الكونغرس، مجلس الشيوخ ومجلس النواب لأول مرة منذ 10 سنوات. مع سيطرتهم الكاملة على الحكومة، كان الديمقراطيون متحمسين لفكرة أنهم يستطيعون تنفيذ العديد من وعودهم الانتخابية. حتى الآن لم يحدث ذلك، وبدلا من الموافقة على قوانين جديدة، كان الجناحان التقدمي والوسط المعتدل في الحزب يقاتلان بعضهما البعض. ومع احتفاظ الجمهوريين بوحدتهم الكاملة ومعارضتهم التامة لمقترحات الديمقراطيين، لم يحدث شيء تقريبا. لم يتم توسيع المنافعة الصحية، ولم يتم وضع برنامج لبناء الطرق والجسور والمطارات، ولم تفرض ضرائب جديدة على الأميركيين الأغنياء. الآن الانتخابات ستجرى بعد سنة، فإن أقارب الساعة تدور لمناقشة مسير أجندة الرئيس بايدن الداخلية وتأثيرها على الحزب الديمقراطي. يسعدني أن أرحب باثنتين من أفضل المراسلين السياسيين المطلعين في واشنطن، بيانكا فاشيني وسارة فارس. Welcome back to داخل Washington. Could America go bankrupt? Were we really on the verge of having our debt limit limited? Well, this happens every now and then, and there is a slight reprieve until December. But this crisis comes up. Why? What does it say about our politics? What does this say about our legislative system? And where are our two parties going on the big budget questions facing our country? To discuss the importance of President Biden's domestic agenda and where it sits on Capitol Hill, I'm delighted to welcome Bianca Fashini and Sarah Ferris. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, Sarah, please explain why every now and then the United States is on the verge of a debt limit crisis, being a bankrupt country unable to pay its bills.
Well, this is a truly American phenomenon. This is it really is a symbol of how dysfunctional Congress and our federal government can be when there is a partisan divide at the center of it. So this happens every couple of years, as you said. Congress has to go through this routine procedural move, which essentially allows the government to pay off the credit card where it has already charged hundreds of billions of dollars. So this is not new money, but because federal debt and the deficit is such a huge, huge political issue, both parties usually use this as a way to score political points. And that's exactly what we saw this year with how tight the divisions in Congress are. It made it really difficult. Democrats had to be Democrats are entirely united on this issue, but they have the Republicans refusing to cooperate to raise the debt limit. And that's essentially why we saw such a standoff. And it really did get the markets jittery about what was going to happen next. And this entire fight, as you said, has been punted to December. And there's really no more clarity of how it will get resolved. All we know is that the party leaders in both Democrats and Republicans say the debt limit should not be breached. They want to keep the full credit of the United States, of course, but both are saying the other side needs to cave in their political position to get there.
So, Bianca, I know you focus professionally quite a lot on young people and their connection to the political system. Does anybody out there understand what this is all about?
I'm gonna go and say no. For most people, I mean, certainly millennials are not as connected, I think, with politics as maybe other generations are. But I think the debt ceiling is something that constantly baffles people. They don't always quite understand what it means and what the challenges are facing our Congress and our country. But I think for young people in particular, they're in such a precarious financial situation. There are so many unique challenges to millennials today versus older generations, student debt being one of those. Millennials care deeply about climate change. A lot of these issues that are included in the Build Back Better agenda, but Congress will not be able to get to that until they can prioritize dealing with the debt ceiling and avoiding a default. But as Sarah was saying, they've punted it off for a little bit, but it is going to come back, later this year, and they're going to have to face that challenge. And that's going to be the priority before virtually any other sort of legislation in Congress.
So before we get to a discussion of the legislation that you're talking about, which really is the centerpiece of the president's domestic agenda, Sarah, is it your sense that Republicans were really at ease with the United States going bankrupt? Was this just a game of brinkmanship? And the Democrats do have 50 votes plus one. Why didn't they just go ahead and do it and get it over with?
Yeah, there were a lot of Republicans who were truly very anxious about this situation. But the reason that the entire Republican Party didn't come to Democrats and say, okay, fine, we'll cooperate, is because there's this procedural move that they believe that Democrats can take on their own. And it's this game of chicken that's playing out where the two sides are arguing over whether or not they should do it this one certain way. And it's become a really ugly mess over process that most people in this country do not care about around the world. This is not something that matters. But what we need to know about the situation basically is that Republicans do not want to hand Democrats a political win by being able to get out of this situation with the help from Republicans. They want Democrats to figure this out on their own and to essentially own the situation and own this ugly mess that's been going on.
That applies even to Republicans one normally thinks of as more or less moderate Republicans, the sort of Mitt Romney type of Republican?
Well, yes, we saw. So in the end, the way that they did punt this was with the help of some Republicans. There were 10 Republicans in the Senate that had to eventually cross the aisle and help Democrats do this. And if you look at that list, it is the type of senators that you're talking about, the moderates. But also, interestingly, those who are retiring, those whose career in politics is sunsetting, or those who are in the Republican leadership. So they have these responsibilities that they have to take. You did not see the average Republican voting for this. But that's not what we expect to see in December. We don't think there's going to be another Republican bailout to help Democrats get out of this situation, because they're really digging in on the idea that Democrats should be able to resolve the situation on their own.
All right, let's broaden this conversation to the big bills out there and what Americans are looking for from this Democratic majority, slim though it may be. Bianca, out there on the hustings, what do people hope? What are the top priorities they hope to see to emerge from all this legislative tussle over reconciliation, budget, infrastructure? What are the top 2 or 3 priorities people really want to see?
Well, I would say, based off of some of the economic data reports that we've gotten just over the past couple weeks, people are worried about things like job security, wages, and inflation. Truly, I mean, just this morning, we got the latest inflation report showing that inflation is actually up a little bit, not by much, but a little bit more than economists expected. And right now, we're heading into the holiday season. We're getting close towards the end of the year. So many consumers are worried about these elevated prices, and they want to know when these prices are going to fall. And then last week, we got the latest monthly jobs report, and that showed that 194,000 jobs were added to the economy when most economists were expecting anywhere from 4 to 5, even 600,000 jobs added. So while the economy has made a lot of improvements since where we were in the beginning of the pandemic, we're still in a place where we don't want to be. We were hoping that by this point, maybe we'd be out of the the depths of the pandemic's effect on the economy, and we're not. So I think a lot of Americans are wondering, how are we going to move forward in a way where we can, find job security, prices coming down, and eliminating this sort of fear that the economy is never going to fully recover, because we've made some headway, but we still have a while to go. And most Americans are dealing with all sorts of financial insecurity, even though we've been living in this pandemic world for over a year now.
So, I mean, clearly the spread of the Delta variant had an impact on jobs, but is there something else going on, something deeper going on as to why, in your view, the job numbers, were positive, but not nearly as robust as many economists hoped for?
Sure. So certainly the Delta variant played a massive role, especially over the past couple months, and in particular in September. And that's why I think the jobs report that we got most recently really demonstrates that, because the monthly jobs report analyzes job activity for the first 2-ish weeks of the prior month, right? So it showed that really hit the economy hard. But aside from the actual number of COVID cases, we're dealing with this issue of small and mid-sized businesses not being able to match the wage increases that some larger businesses are able to level up in order to attract people to work. Right now, there are still millions of Americans looking for a full-time job, but the pandemic really changed the nature of work and the nature of the job hunt for so many people. The average person is not willing to go work a minimum wage job just to pass time now. They want to know that they can get something that will offer a permanent, fulfilling salary to help them pay their bills during this time of financial uncertainty. So certainly COVID will continue to hamper things like the monthly jobs report or the weekly jobless claims or a variety of other economic data reports. But it's also definitely going to be an issue of wages moving forward, and how small and mid-sized companies can, or if they can, continue to attract workers. And then also things like, the supply chain shortage. That's frustrating for consumers. It's also a really big challenge for businesses.
All right, when we come back after the break, Sarah, I'm going to ask you to take a look at the internal challenge among Democrats as we get through this negotiation for the two big bills that are on the legislative agenda in just a moment. Again, my guests today on Dakhel, Washington include Bianca Fascini. Bianca is a Washington-based economics correspondent for Newsy, a digital news outlet targeting millennials, zennials, and Gen Z, also known as the TikTok generation. She also covers politics, including the 2018 midterm elections. Also joining us is Sarah Ferris. Sarah's congressional reporter for Politico, an all-politics, all-the-time news site based here in Washington. Among her claims to fame, Sarah's family owns one of New England's most beloved brands of ice cream. That, for New Englanders, is really important. All right, Sarah, let's talk a bit about progressives and moderates in the Democratic Party. They often seem to be at odds with each other, almost like Democrats versus Republicans. What is the state of play in terms of the negotiation for a huge spending bill that President Biden wants to get approved?
So Democrats like to call themselves the big tent party. They have a very diverse range of ideological views in their party. And we are seeing this play out very intensely right now, because this is what President Biden is drafting right now. This legislation might be the party's biggest chance to get something done, even greater than the scope of huge social safety net programs like the Great Society, going back decades. They really see this as a generational chance to expand the reach of government, to really help people who have spent decades needing more federal assistance. And so what we're seeing right now is the moderates of the party and the progressives of the party engaged in kind of these existential questions about the role of government, about how the federal spending should be divvied up among all these various populations. And so what we're seeing is, on all these various issues, universal childcare, free community college, expanding healthcare benefits to seniors. Every segment of this party has a different view of how it should get done, how long this assistance should last. And these are really deep policy questions. People have been debating these for decades, and it's all coming to a head right now as they're debating this bill and trying to get this bill done by the end of October. And so not only are these just really, really big questions that any party would have to tackle, but this is also the most narrowly divided Congress that we've seen in decades. So Democrats have to have almost entire unanimity within their party to get anything done. You cannot lose a single Democrat in the Senate, and you can only lose a handful of Democrats in the House. And this is basically, it's hard to overstate how difficult this is going to be for party leaders, not just because of how just how different their party is, but because of potential lasting impact of these programs. Everyone wants to be the one that helps create this legacy for the party.
And I mean, we're talking some fairly large numbers. Large. It's so large it's difficult to conceive the difference between, $1.5 trillion, 2 trillion, 3.5 trillion. I've never seen that much money before. I don't know if either of you have. And this is, how do you even conceive of this much money and its long-term impact on the economy? Does the debate over these numbers trickle down? Do people appreciate what is going on here, Bianca?
I think that probably depends on which party you are a part of. I think for the Democrats, they really see this as this significant long-term bill that could really help lift the economy out of the recession if they were to get it passed. But like we were sort of talking about earlier in the program, a lot of people are dealing with significant financial uncertainty right now. So the longer this bill takes to be negotiated among Democrats and then discussed with Republicans, the farther out of voters' minds it might get, because there are so many questions that we have to face right now before we get to passing the Build Back Better agenda if it is passed, and then once it's implemented, and then also we have to deal with another debt ceiling talk by the end of the year. So I think what voters probably want to see right now on either side is immediate action, and so they see that inflation's rising, jobs are not where we thought they might be by now. So what can we do right now to make things and alleviate the pressure on the average consumer and the average voter?
And if the question, Sarah, is what we can do right now, as Bianca posed, why is it so tough for President Biden to impose a little discipline on his party and get these things done?
Well, basically, the problem comes down to numbers. If the Senate Democrats had even one or two more members of their party in the Senate, they wouldn't be in this pickle that they're in right now. But they have to have every single member of their 50-member caucus in agreement. And you have folks coming from the most conservative states in the country, West Virginia. This is not a state that Democrats typically represent. And then you have, states like New York or California, where some of these progressive policies have been pushed for decades. And it's just these really big existential questions about what does it mean to be a Democrat? What is a progressive? What are liberal ideas? What should be a part of a massive expansion of the social safety net? And if there was even one or two senators that they could spare to lose the votes, President Biden would have a lot easier time, but he has to have every single member of his party in the Senate on board.
And Bianca, in a broader sense, when you look at younger generation in America today, about how many characterize themselves as progressive? And when they use that term, what do they mean?
That's a good question. I mean, I unfortunately don't have too many statistics to rattle off right now, but I think millennials and Gen Z certainly interpret the term progressive differently than a baby boomer or somebody of an older generation might interpret that. I would also, point out that while young people certainly care about politics and they care about what's going on in Washington, they're certainly changing attitudes. And I think that's very much reflected in polls that we get all the time that show a lot of young people are really disaffected by capitalism. And the way that they view capitalism versus the way that their parents or grandparents view it is significantly different. And that's something that lawmakers on both sides of the aisle in Washington are going to have to grapple with, especially when they push forward any sort of legislation that could directly affect the economy, because young people have a more favorable view, not majority, but they have a more favorable view of socialist policies. Is certainly different than the way that their parents or grandparents would have interpreted any sort of socialist leaning policy from Washington decades ago.
Bianca Fascini, Sarah Ferris, thank you very much for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. If you watch this show regularly, you know that I am a traditionalist about many aspects of American politics. I believe in the two-party system, even though it appears broken at the moment. I believe in the separation of powers inherent in our Constitution, even though it slows the pace of often much-needed change and reform. I believe that our elected representatives usually rise to the occasion to do the right thing, though often for the wrong reasons, even though a depressingly large number now seem wedded to the wrong thing for the wrong reasons. And I believe that the American people, when presented with alternative paths, usually make the wise choice, which is why our 245 years of a continuous democratic self-government is the envy of the world, recent hiccups notwithstanding. But every once in a while, something happens which jolts me into a politics-induced depression. Someone in a position of responsibility does something so crazy, so devoid of reason or rationality, so contrary to the national interest that it makes you want to scream, like that television news character played by Peter Finch in that terrific 1976 film Network, when he said, quote, "I'm mad like hell and I'm not going to take it anymore." Well, welcome to the national circus called the debt ceiling debate. I will stipulate at the outset that I don't know why, and I don't know who, and I don't know which legislative masochist set up a system designed to wreak national political havoc every now and then. Since we have a budget, why we need a separate standalone vote to raise the government's ability to borrow to meet its financial obligations makes little sense to me. But that's the system, and the vote should be automatic and non-controversial. That's because every member of Congress who has ever voted for any spending, any defense spending, any health spending, any education spending, even spending on their own salaries, has voted to increase the government's obligation. It only stands to reason they should support the government's ability to pay its bills. Republicans don't like the Democrats' proposed spending legislation. Fine, they should vote against it, just as Democrats voted against Republican tax cuts in previous administrations. That's fair and appropriate. But to use the debt limit ceiling as a political weapon is, in my view, wrong and irresponsible, a principle I believe should apply to leaders and backbenchers of both parties. We have very important business to take care of in Washington. A lot needs fixing. A lot of issues need to be addressed. I think it's great when politicians fight like hell over issues that separate them, often finding compromises that make our nation stronger. I think it's terrible when that fight is focused on an issue that can only undermine confidence in the credit and reputation of the United States of America. Enough of this. Let's move on. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول وحدة الحزب الديمقراطي، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ InsideWashington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.